A retired FBI agent going public to defend Annie Guthrie, Savannah Guthrie's sister, on day 74. And when that happens in an open case with no arrest, no named suspect, and no resolution, the question is no longer just what people are saying about Annie. The question becomes something else. What is happening around this family that makes a public defense necessary right now? Because when an investigation reaches that point, it starts entering dangerous territory. I'm Daniel Cross, and this is Evidence HQ. For daily true crime updates backed by verified sources, subscribe and turn on notifications now. We cover the latest developments, the confirmed details, and the evidence that matters most. Now let's get into it. Now here is what has been confirmed. According to the update now circulating around the case, a retired FBI agent is publicly defending Annie Guthrie amid accusations and speculation still surrounding Nancy Guthrie's family. That alone does not prove new evidence. It does not prove a formal shift in the investigation. It does not prove Annie has become an official focus of law enforcement. And it does not prove that some hidden new fact is sitting behind this public defense. But it does prove something else. It proves that the environment around the family is still hot enough to require a public response. And that is exactly where this case becomes more interesting and more dangerous. Because 74 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the public still does not have what it should have. No arrest, no named suspect, no resolution, no closure. And do you know what happens when a case this large remains unresolved? The vacuum starts to fill. Not with evidence, not with proof, not with confirmed fact, with rumor, with theory, with accusation, with emotional interpretation, with conclusions built before confirmation ever arrives. And that is exactly where major cases start drifting off course. I want you to think with me about a very specific pattern. When an investigation is clearly moving forward, where does public attention go? It goes to evidence, to surveillance, to forensic results, to the timeline, to law enforcement movement, to the things that actually change the case. But when the case stalls, or at least appears stalled from the outside, that same energy starts flowing somewhere else. It leaves the evidence and moves into interpretation. It leaves the lead and moves into personality. It leaves the fact and moves into the surroundings. And that is how family members, neighbors, and people close to the victim get pulled into a spiral that often does not have enough real foundation underneath it. Not necessarily because they did something, but because they are close, because they are visible, because the public needs somewhere to put its anxiety. And to me, that is the real danger of day 74. Today, the question is not only what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Today, the question is also how did a criminal investigation reach the point where publicly defending a family member became the headline? Because that tells us a lot. It tells us this case is still open enough to generate fear, still large enough to generate speculation, and most importantly, it tells us the public conversation around it may be starting to consume itself. Let's be very clear about one thing. I am not saying no one can ask questions. They can. Major cases create legitimate questions. People observe behavior, they try to understand relationships, they examine timing, they notice reactions. That is inevitable. The problem is not the question. The problem begins at one very specific point. When the question stops being a question and turns into a conclusion without confirmation, that is where the line gets crossed. Because from that moment on, the case stops being an investigation into what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and it starts becoming a public contest over who looks guilty, who looks strange, who said too little, who said too much, who reacted the right way, who reacted the wrong way, who fits best into a ready-made theory someone decided to build. And ready-made theories are some of the most dangerous things in an open case because they offer the feeling of clarity without offering proof of any kind. They sound intelligent, they feel convincing, they seem organized, but they are still structures without confirmation. That is why when a retired FBI agent appears publicly to defend Annie, my reaction is not "this solved anything." My reaction is this reveals the current stage of the public conversation. It reveals that the pressure has become too intense. It reveals that the accusations have become too visible. It reveals that someone with investigative credibility decided it was necessary to say publicly that this conversation has gone too far. And that reaction alone already tells a story. It tells the story of a case that remains unresolved. It tells the story of a frustrated audience. It tells the story of coverage that risks losing focus. And it tells the story of a family that, on top of trauma, is now being forced to absorb the full force of public speculation. That is not a side detail. That is a symptom. And I think it is important to connect this to what we were already seeing in the last few days. Yesterday, the focus was increased police patrols near Annie and Tommaso. The mood was local tension, complaints, police presence, growing disruption. Today, the shape of the story has changed. Today, the story is not patrols, it is reputation. Yesterday, the pressure looked territorial. Today, it looks reputational. And that shift matters, because when pressure changes form without losing intensity, it usually means the underlying problem is still there. The temperature did not fall. It just found a new place to appear. And that is exactly what I think we are seeing here. Not a new solution, not a new investigative breakthrough, but a new sign of the accumulated strain created by an unresolved case. Now, I want to ask the central question of this video: why is this public defense of Annie happening now? Why now? Why on day 74? Why not on day 20? Why not on day 40? Why not on day 60? I see three possible readings. The first is the simplest. The accusations became intense enough to require a response. No extra mystery, no hidden strategy, no coded message. Just an attempt to slow down a wave of public suspicion that crossed the line. The second reading is more operational. Defending Annie now may be an effort to pull the focus back where it belongs, to move attention away from reputational collapse around the family and back toward what should still be driving this case: the offender, the timeline, the evidence, the suspect's movement, the physical reality of what happened. The third reading is the most uncomfortable. This defense may be a symptom that the public conversation has already drifted too far from what is actually confirmed. And if that is true, then it says less about Annie and far more about the narrative instability now building around the case as a whole. Of those three readings, the second seems the most useful to me. But the third is the one that worries me most. Because if coverage reaches the point where every silence becomes a clue, every family member becomes a target, and every side detail becomes maybe the key, then the truth does not get closer. It gets farther away. And that is the real cost of a case that goes too long without concrete answers. People cannot tolerate a vacuum forever. So they start filling it. Sometimes with instinct, sometimes with emotion, sometimes with projection, sometimes with the simple need to feel that they understand something before investigators do. But understanding before the proof arrives is not understanding, it is anticipation. And anticipation without confirmation produces far more noise than clarity. That is why I think the most important point in this video is this. The public defense of Annie is not the whole story. It is a symptom of a bigger story. A story about a case that remains open, remains emotionally charged, remains unresolved, and keeps pulling people close to the victim into the gravitational field of the public investigation itself. And as long as that keeps happening, this kind of headline will keep appearing. Maybe in the form of patrols, maybe in the form of accusations, maybe in the form of a public defense, maybe in the form of recycled theories, maybe in the form of conflict between coverage, family, and community. But the root remains the same. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, the suspect still has no name, and the case still has no public ending. That is why I also do not want to overstate what this headline means. This video is not saying that a retired FBI agent solved the case. It is not saying Annie has become the official center of the investigation. And it is not saying that this public defense changes the investigative path by itself. What this video is saying is something more precise. On day 74, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is still generating noise, pressure, and instability at such a high level that publicly defending Annie Guthrie has now become a news story. And that is a signal, not of resolution, but of strain. And strain matters in a long case because strain changes behavior, it changes language, it changes willingness to speak, it changes the quality of the conversation, it changes how the public interprets every new detail. And when the quality of the conversation declines, the quality of attention declines with it. That is bad for the family, bad for the community, and potentially bad for the case itself. Because there comes a point in every major story when the search for novelty starts manufacturing novelty where none actually exists. That is the line I never want this channel to cross. If the audience expects a bombshell every single day, but the real case does not produce one every day, people start looking for a bombshell in every gesture, every absence, every neighbor, every relative, every side movement. And when there are too many targets, there is no direction. When there is no direction, there is no discipline. And when there is no discipline, the victim risks disappearing a second time, not physically, but inside the noise. So, what does this story really reveal? To me, three things. First, the family remains at the center of the public heat surrounding this case, and there is no real sign of relief. Second, the public conversation risks spending too much energy on lateral speculation. Third, the longer this case goes without a concrete answer, the more important it becomes to separate fact, interpretation, pressure, and evidence with absolute discipline. Without that separation, every major case becomes a mirror. Everyone projects onto it whatever they most want to see. And when that happens, the real investigation starts losing ground to the loudest narrative. And maybe that is the most revealing point of all. The retired FBI agent who went public to defend Annie chose to do that now on day 74, not at the beginning, not in the middle now. So the question that remains open at the end of this video is the one I want to keep following from here. What changed in the last few weeks that made this public defense necessary at this exact moment that still has not been answered? And that is exactly why this story matters. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI and tell me what you think in the comments because I want to read your take. Do you think this public defense of Annie is simply a reaction to excessive accusations? Or does it show that the conversation around this case is already starting to come completely off the rails?